Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
You ever walked into a room and felt, deep in your chest, that something was off, not quite wrong, but tilted just enough to make you brace yourself for impact? That was the air the night my father called us together for what he insisted was a special family dinner, which, coming from a man who never said more than a dozen words at any one time unless he was yelling at a television, already felt suspect. The table was set like a Thanksgiving postcard, too perfect, too deliberate, down to the cloth napkins that nobody used since Mom died. Her old china was out, the good stuff with the tiny blue flowers around the edge, and the roast smelled like she'd made it herself, even though she'd been gone 8 years now, and the only thing Frank could cook was burnt toast and judgment. Adam was already there when I arrived, of course he was, golden boy that he is, always 5 minutes early to everything my father cares about and late to everything else. His wife Rachel was sitting beside him with her usual white wine and tight smile, the kind of expression that says, I know I married an idiot, but I'm banking on the inheritance, and I don't say that lightly. The three of them were already sipping their drinks, talking in those polite half-laughs people use when they're performing the idea of family. I kissed my dad on the cheek, said hello, and took my usual seat across from Adam, so I could see the bullshit coming straight on. There was no birthday, no anniversary, no holiday, just this mysterious family meal dropped into the middle of December like a ticking clock. And right away, I knew something was coming. My father, Frank, retired cop, part-time tyrant, and full-time grudge holder, sat at the head of the table like a man who had already won a battle the rest of us didn't know we were fighting. He carved the roast slowly, deliberately, the way he used to cut into Adam's school steaks when he was showing him how a real man eats, and I swear to God, the room was so quiet you could hear the knife grating the bone. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with ceremony or grace or even a damn greeting. It was like reading a traffic report. Well, he said, clearing his throat, not even looking up from his plate. I figured I'd better tell you both now. I've updated my will. Everything goes to Adam. The house, the land, the accounts. Everything. Just like that. Not a pause, not an explanation, not even a glance in my direction. He might as well have told me he'd sold the dog I didn't have. I felt my throat tighten, not because I wanted his damn money, believe me. I built my life expecting nothing from him, but because of what it meant. The final nail. The last word in a lifelong sermon that started before I was old enough to know I was listening. Adam didn't say a word. Rachel sipped her wine, eyes flicking toward me like she was waiting for the show to start. Frank just kept chewing, like it was no more important than whether he'd remembered to turn off the porch light. I waited 5 seconds, 10, maybe more. Let the silence do its own damage. Then I lifted my glass, still smiling, heart racing under the calm like a freight train beneath a frozen lake. Well, I said, raising my voice just enough to slice through the quiet. Then I guess he'll be paying for your nursing home too. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. That sentence landed like a brick through glass. The silence afterward had weight. You could hear a fork drop, literally. Rachel's fork hit the edge of her plate and clinked like a punchline. Adam looked like he was about to say something but thought better of it. My father's face didn't change, not even a twitch in his jaw, but I saw his hand stop moving, just for a second, and I knew I'd hit bone. I didn't look away. I didn't blink. I took a sip, put my glass down, and started cutting my meat like nothing happened. Nobody else moved. Nobody breathed. And in that long, cold stillness, I could feel everything I'd swallowed over the past 40 years come rising up behind my ribs, every snide comment, every time he told me I was too emotional, every time he bragged about Adam's baseball stats and forgot I graduated with honors. All of it, piled high behind my smile. That was the moment something shifted, not just in the room, but in me. I'd never needed his money, but that night I realized I needed something else. Not revenge exactly, no, something colder. I wanted him to see who Adam really was, and more than that, I wanted Adam to feel what it was like to hold something too big for him. To have the crown placed on his head and realize it was made of thorns. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted to watch the two of them unravel with the same quiet fury they'd spent decades pretending didn't exist. Frank cleared his throat again. He didn't apologize. He didn't explain. Just said I thought it was fair, like fairness was a thing he'd ever understood. Adam looked at me, kind of sheepish, like he hadn't expected this to sting me, but not sorry enough to say a word. Rachel broke the tension by asking if anyone wanted more wine, like we were still pretending we were just a family, having a pleasant meal. I leaned back, folded my napkin, and said I was good. More than good. Because that night, for the first time in a very long time, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. There's a peculiar kind of silence that follows a betrayal that's been decades in the making, a silence not born out of shock exactly, but more like the dull, hollow echo of something you always suspected would come to pass, but still somehow hoped might not. That was the silence that filled the space between us in the days after the dinner, lingering in voicemails left unanswered and messages ignored, heavy like smoke after a fire that refused to fully die. I went home that night and sat in my car for nearly 20 minutes before I even took the keys out of the ignition, just staring at the steering wheel, replaying his words again and again in my head like a scratched record that refused to skip forward. It wasn't just the money, God knows it was never about the money for me. I'd made peace with not being the favorite a long time ago, or so I thought. I had built a life for myself outside of the Frank and Adam orbit, one that was hard-earned and modest, but entirely my own. No handouts, no shortcuts, no trust fund safety nets. But something about the finality of it, about the way he said it like it was the weather report, like I was nothing more than background noise to the legacy he'd already decided belonged solely to his son, made something inside me that I hadn't even realized was still tender start to burn. I didn't call him. I didn't call Adam. I didn't even talk to my closest friend about it because I knew what they'd say, and frankly, I didn't need the validation or the pity. What I needed was quiet, space to think, to remember, to trace the roots of the ache that had been growing inside me since I was old enough to notice that no matter how loud I spoke, my voice never seemed to reach him. That night, in a fit of something between insomnia and agitation, I went into the garage to dig through the old boxes I'd never unpacked after my last move. I was looking for something, maybe a photo, maybe an old journal, I didn't really know, but what I found was a box I hadn't touched since we'd cleaned out Mom's things after the funeral. It still smelled faintly like her, that strange mix of lavender and ivory soap, and I stood there for a long while with my hand resting on the lid, not ready to open it, but not ready to walk away either. Inside was everything she'd kept that we'd never noticed, cards we'd made as kids, a program from my college graduation folded neatly with a ribbon around it, even one of Adam's childhood drawings that, despite being nothing more than scribbles, had genius, scrawled in Dad's handwriting on the back. But underneath it all was something I hadn't seen before, a small leather notebook, the kind she used to jot things down in when she thought no one was looking. The pages were brittle, yellowed at the edges, and as I flipped through them, it became painfully clear that it wasn't just recipes or grocery lists. It was thoughts, observations, doubts, worries. And then, tucked near the back, was a single folded sheet of paper with my name written on the front in her careful, slanted handwriting. It wasn't long, not even a full page, but it landed with the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. She'd written it not long before she died, from the date at the top. In it, she talked about regret, not the kind that comes from things you did, but the deeper kind that comes from the things you let happen, the things you watched and did nothing about. She said she wished she'd spoken up more, that she'd defended me when Frank dismissed me as too emotional or too complicated. She admitted, plainly and without excuse, that she had stood by while he built Adam up and chipped me down, and that by the time she'd realized the damage he'd done, and how complicit she had been in her silence, it had felt too late. I read it twice, then 3 times, and by the end I was gripping the edges like it might vanish from my hands if I let go. I didn't cry, not exactly, but I felt something loosen in my chest, something old and knotted and tight finally give way, like a rope that had been pulled too taut for too long. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel crazy for remembering things the way I did. I didn't feel petty or vindictive or dramatic. I felt seen. Finally. By the only person who ever really tried. The next day, I called Adam. I told him, in the flattest voice I could manage, that if he needed help figuring out how to transfer the property title or handle the legal paperwork, I was available. He sounded surprised, which I found interesting, but he accepted. Said thanks in that hesitant tone of his, like he was waiting for a punchline. I hung up before he could find one. Helping him wasn't about kindness or forgiveness. It was strategy. A way in. A front row seat. I wanted to see exactly what he was going to do with everything he'd been handed. I wanted to be close enough to watch it fall apart. And part of me, I'll admit it, wanted Frank to ask me for help. Not because I needed his gratitude, but because I wanted him to feel that slow, creeping awareness that maybe he'd bet on the wrong horse. What I didn't expect, though, was what came next. Because when I returned to the house to start walking Adam through the estate paperwork, I found Rachel pacing in the hallway, tense and irritated. And when I walked past her into the den where my father kept his files, I noticed something odd: papers stacked haphazardly, documents missing signatures, a file labeled insurance with nothing inside. Adam, it turned out, had no idea what he was doing. He looked at me with that familiar sheepish smile and shrugged, saying, "Dad said you were always the organized one," as if that was an olive branch and not a half-hearted insult wrapped in a compliment. I smiled back, just barely, and said, "Well, let's get started then." Because at that moment, I knew this story wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. There's something unsettling about watching someone else wear a crown that was never meant for them, especially when they don't even realize how crooked it looks on their head. And as I sat across from Adam that afternoon, sorting through the mess of disorganized papers and signed forms and forgotten deadlines that he was now apparently responsible for, I couldn't help but wonder if my father had even bothered to explain what everything entailed, or if he'd simply handed over the keys with a pat on the back and the assumption that Adam would somehow figure it all out by the sheer force of his charm and entitlement. The truth was, Adam had spent so much of his life being rewarded for mediocrity that he'd come to believe competence was inherent, not earned, and it was becoming clearer with every passing hour that he was in way over his head. The house, the land, the accounts, my father's so-called legacy, wasn't just a neat package tied with a bow. It was a tangle of taxes, legal obligations, deferred maintenance, and half-finished paperwork, most of which had been kept in that cluttered den that still smelled faintly of cigar smoke and masculine ego. The place was a shrine to Frank's delusions of order: files stuffed into drawers at random, important documents jammed between baseball schedules and clippings from newspapers dating back to the early 90s, as if memory alone could substitute for actual organization. And there was Adam, with his rolled-up sleeves and that same confused look he used to wear during math tests, staring at the pile in front of him like it might sprout legs and walk itself to the courthouse. I watched him for a while without offering help, not out of cruelty, but because I wanted him to feel the full weight of the mess he'd inherited, not just the paperwork, but the decades of unearned praise, of blind trust, of being told he was capable when no one ever asked him to prove it. He kept shifting in his seat, clicking a pen without writing anything, occasionally glancing at me as if waiting for me to step in and rescue him the way I used to when we were kids, and he forgot his homework or missed a deadline. I didn't. Not right away. Instead, I leaned back and let the silence stretch, let it build like heat between us, and when he finally sighed and muttered something about not realizing how complicated this would be, I tilted my head, smiled just a little, and said, "Yeah. Responsibility tends to be messy when you've never had to carry it." He didn't respond. He didn't have to. The truth landed harder than anything I could have planned. Later that evening, when I returned home, I opened the notebook again, the one I'd found in Mom's box, the one with the quiet apology buried in her neat cursive, and I read it again, more slowly this time, letting each word settle into the hollows they were meant to fill. It wasn't just guilt she was expressing, it was a map, a breadcrumb trail left behind not just to explain her silence, but to expose his noise. She had known. Maybe not everything, but enough. Enough to write about the day Frank told her that girls were meant to be softened by struggle, that too much praise would make me weak, while boys needed to be filled with confidence like air in a balloon. She had disagreed, but she had not stopped him. And that was what haunted her. At the very end of the notebook, tucked behind the last page, was something I hadn't noticed before. A second piece of paper, older and more fragile than the first, folded twice over and nearly translucent at the creases. It wasn't addressed to me directly, but it was clearly meant to be found. Perhaps not then, perhaps never, but fate or guilt or dumb luck had placed it in my hands now. It was written in my mother's hand, but the tone was different, sharper, more deliberate. In it, she detailed a moment I had forgotten completely, or maybe one I had tried to forget, the day she caught Frank reallocating a savings account that had originally been started in my name when I was 10, emptied out and merged into the one he'd started for Adam 2 years later. She hadn't confronted him, she said, not because she was afraid, but because she knew how it would end. Denial, defensiveness, then weeks of silence and cold shoulders that wore her down more effectively than any argument. She had learned over the years that Frank didn't bend, he calcified. That letter, the second one, changed something in me. Not because it confirmed what I already suspected, but because it revealed the pattern that had always existed beneath our family story, the machinery turning behind the curtain. I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't dramatizing the past. I had been stolen from not just in money, but in time, in attention, in affirmation. And now, decades later, I was being asked to sit quietly while my father handed the rest of it to the man who already had more than he'd ever earned. So, I did what anyone raised in the quiet shadow of someone else's spotlight might do. I made myself useful. I offered to draft a timeline for the estate processing to help Adam understand which taxes would hit when, what kind of lawyer he might need to consult, and how certain assets might trigger capital gains if he wasn't careful. I laid it all out neatly, clearly, with just enough subtlety to make it look like I was helping when in fact I was dragging him deeper into the swamp. Every recommendation I gave him came with a thread tied back to me, a detail he'd forget or misinterpret, which meant he'd have to come back and ask again. Every favor was a hook. Every kindness a slow twist of the knife. And then I waited. Because what Adam didn't know, what Frank couldn't even imagine, is that when you've spent your whole life being underestimated, you learn how to make invisibility a weapon. You learn how to smile while building a trap, how to speak softly while loading the barrel, how to laugh while the house around you shifts ever so slightly off its foundation. And when the cracks begin to show, when the first leak appears, or the first deal slips through his fingers, I'll be there. Not to catch him, but to remind him who helped build the house in the first place. Power, I've learned, doesn't come all at once like a lightning strike or some divine declaration. It settles in slowly, seeps into the cracks of a situation until the balance of control has shifted completely, often without anyone realizing it until it's too late to reverse course. And that's exactly how things began to unfold over the following weeks, as I positioned myself not as an enemy of the new heir to my father's carefully constructed empire of overinflated value and underexplained holdings, but as the quietly indispensable shadow behind the scenes, the one person Adam found himself unable to function without, even as he tried so desperately to maintain the illusion that he was in charge. The thing is, being underestimated isn't just familiar to me, it's comfortable. I know how to move in silence, how to say less and mean more, and how to make my confidence look like coincidence until the person in power starts leaning on it like a crutch they didn't realize they needed. By the third time Adam called me in a panic because he'd forgotten a filing deadline or botched a document submission, I had stopped even pretending to be surprised. His voice on the phone always carried that same edge of frantic charm, the kind that tries to make a mistake sound like an opportunity, as though saying, "I'm such a mess right now," with a sheepish laugh somehow turned incompetence into endearment. But I didn't laugh. I never did. I let the silence on my end stretch just long enough for him to hear it, to feel the discomfort settle in, and then I'd offer a solution, not because I was feeling generous, but because every time he accepted my help, he owed me something, even if he didn't realize it yet. Frank, meanwhile, remained obstinately detached from the reality he had created. He continued living in that decaying house with the peeling shutters and the overgrown garden that Adam was now responsible for maintaining, blissfully unaware, or maybe unwilling to acknowledge, that the man he had chosen to carry his legacy was barely keeping his head above water. He still spoke about Adam like he was made of iron and ambition, rattling off old stories of Little League trophies and science fair ribbons as if they held any relevance to a man who now couldn't manage to locate the deed to the family property without calling me 3 times in one afternoon. But even Frank, stubborn as he was, couldn't ignore what was happening forever. The turning point came the day I received the late-night call, not from Adam this time, but from Frank himself, his voice more gravelly than usual, the words slower, heavier, as if each one had to be dragged out from somewhere reluctant. He asked if I could come by in the morning, said there was something he needed my help with. That was all. No apology. No explanation. Just a request, heavy with something that felt almost like resignation. When I arrived, the house was darker than usual, even though it was late morning, and the air inside was thick with that sour scent that hangs in places no longer maintained properly: old coffee, damp wood, and a kind of defeat that settles into the walls. Frank was sitting in his chair, the same worn recliner he'd had since I was a kid, the same one he used to fall asleep in while pretending to watch the news. He didn't stand when I entered, didn't look surprised to see me, just motioned toward the stack of documents on the side table with a grunt and muttered, "Your brother made a mess of something again." I didn't respond immediately. I just walked over, picked up the paperwork, and started flipping through it. It was worse than I expected. Adam had mishandled a small but crucial property tax payment, letting it lapse past the grace period, which meant not only a penalty but also a red flag in the local records that could complicate future sales or development. A minor screw-up on the surface, but one with ripple effects that could cost thousands later. I explained this to Frank as calmly as I could, watching his expression harden not with anger, but with something closer to disappointment, the kind of deep, reluctant awareness that seeps into someone who's spent a lifetime denying the truth. He didn't say much, just nodded slowly and muttered something about Adam being busy and trying his best, but the words sounded brittle, hollow, and I knew in that moment he was beginning to see it. That evening, as I was leaving, I found Rachel waiting near the porch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest and her face set in that tense, brittle expression I'd come to associate with women who were starting to realize that the foundation under their feet was crumbling. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "What exactly are you doing, Helen?" she asked, her voice low but sharp, like a needle slipped between ribs. "Are you trying to make Adam look bad? Trying to worm your way back in?" I met her stare and didn't flinch. "I'm not trying," I said, letting the words hang there. "I don't need to try. He's doing a fine job of that all on his own." She stepped forward slightly, her jaw tightening. "Frank is still his father." "And mine," I replied, quietly but firmly. "Though you wouldn't know it from the way he handed everything over like I was never part of the family to begin with." There was a long pause, and for a brief second, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Not sympathy, not guilt, but fear. Not of me, exactly, but of what I represented. The past that wouldn't stay buried, the person who knew where the cracks were because she'd grown up inside them. Rachel wasn't stupid. She knew Adam wasn't up to the task. She just didn't expect the person standing across from her to be willing to expose it one mistake at a time. A few days later, I received a call from a lawyer, not my father's, but a separate estate attorney Frank had apparently contacted on his own. The message was simple. There had been a recent amendment to the will. I was now listed as a secondary executor. I didn't call Frank to ask why. I didn't need to. The move wasn't a reversal of his favoritism, not an admission of guilt or a grand gesture of redemption. It was a contingency plan, his version of a parachute, created not out of trust in me but out of doubt in Adam. But even that small shift was enough. Enough to let me know that my presence, my persistence, my quiet competence had started to erode the myths he'd built around his son like armor. And while Frank may never fully admit he was wrong, the simple fact that he had allowed a sliver of control to pass into my hands was more powerful than any apology he could offer. It meant the crown was slipping. And when it finally fell, I would be the only one standing close enough to pick it up, whether I wanted it or not. There are moments in life when everything slows down, Not in that dramatic, cinematic way people like to describe when they talk about car accidents or falling in love, but in a much quieter, more deliberate rhythm, where time doesn't freeze, but simply tightens its grip around you, forcing you to notice things you normally overlook, the way a voice hesitates just a fraction longer than it should, the faint crack in someone's composure when they think no one's watching, the subtle shift in a room, when control begins to change hands. That's what the weeks felt like after I found out my name had been added to the will as secondary executor, a slow, coiling shift in atmosphere, as if the air in every room I walked into was now bending slightly in my direction. Just enough to remind me that whatever game we were playing, I had finally stepped onto the board. Adam, of course, had no idea. He was too caught up in the whirlwind of obligations he couldn't manage and responsibilities he didn't understand, still convinced that the title of heir came with automatic competency, as though inheritance itself was a kind of transfusion that could turn weakness into wisdom overnight. The calls came more frequently now, always with that strained friendliness that tried to mask desperation, issues with the insurance company, a disagreement with the accountant, an urgent need to figure out how zoning permits work, which was laughable considering he had once failed an online driver's ed course for not reading the material. I helped, but always on my terms, always with a kind of careful detachment that allowed me to maintain control while appearing benevolent. I never offered more than what was asked, but I made sure every solution I gave him required some effort to understand, some small thread that led back to me. Frank, on the other hand, had begun to unravel in a different way, not outwardly, not with any great emotional display, but in small, perceptible ways that you'd miss if you weren't paying attention. He repeated himself more, forgot names of people he'd worked with for 20 years, and once left the oven on long enough to set off the smoke detector. He waved it off, of course, called it nothing, said everyone slips up now and then, but I saw the fear behind his eyes, the kind men like him don't know how to express. The kind that comes when a man who's defined himself by his authority begins to suspect that the world no longer answers to his commands. So I did what I knew he would least expect. I offered to take him on a tour of an assisted living facility, framing it not as a necessity, but as a just-in-case, a way to get ahead of the curve. He said no the first 2 times I brought it up, snapping that he wasn't ready for some goddamn old folks' home, but the 3rd time, after he'd lost his balance on the front steps and nearly fell, he agreed. Quietly. With that same clenched jaw he used to wear when he knew I was right but hated the fact that I had to be the one to say it. The place I brought him to wasn't the cheap, antiseptic version he probably imagined. It was elegant, understated, with wide windows and soft lighting and a garden that bloomed in neat little squares like something out of a magazine. The staff were warm without being cloying, the residents lively without being forced, and the whole experience had a kind of dignity to it that I knew would appeal to whatever remnants of pride Frank still held onto. He didn't say much during the tour, just nodded and made a few dry observations, but I saw the way he lingered near the common room bookshelf, the way his eyes tracked the movement of a group of men playing cards near the fireplace. He didn't admit anything, not directly, but when we got back in the car, he said, "Not bad," which, coming from him, might as well have been a love letter. It was the next day that I planned the second dinner, not because I wanted a repeat of the first disaster, but because I knew it was time to put things in the open, to pull back the last veil and let the weight of everything settle where it belonged. I invited Adam and Rachel, told them it was just a family meal to talk logistics, nothing formal, just a casual regroup. They accepted, probably assuming it was another opportunity for me to do their homework for them. The evening began quietly, with the same forced politeness and brittle smiles, but this time, I didn't sit across from Adam. I sat beside him, angled just slightly toward Frank, and halfway through the meal, I reached into my bag and pulled out the notebook, Mom's notebook, the one I had read and reread so many times the paper had begun to soften at the edges. Without preamble, without drama, I placed it on the table and flipped to the letter addressed to me, and then, in a voice as even as I could manage, I read it aloud. Every word was a scalpel, clean, sharp, undeniable. The regrets, the apologies, the confessions. Rachel froze, wine glass halfway to her lips. Adam stared at his plate like it might open up and swallow him. Frank didn't move, didn't blink, but the color drained from his face slowly, inch by inch, until he looked more like a statue of himself than the man who once barked orders like gospel. When I finished, I folded the page and slid it back into the notebook, then looked at each of them in turn. She saw it, I said. She saw what was happening, even if she couldn't stop it. And now, so do I. No one spoke. Not right away. Rachel was the first to break, muttering something about the past being the past and how none of this was productive. Adam, red-faced and glassy-eyed, finally asked if I had brought us all together just to humiliate him. I didn't answer that. Instead, I turned to Frank, who still hadn't spoken, and said, "The difference between you and her is that she regretted her silence. You built yours into a throne." That was the end of it. No grand arguments. No apologies. No breakdowns. Just silence, heavy and honest, finally, for the first time in years. A few months passed. Frank moved into the assisted living facility, on his own terms, but with my coordination. He didn't say thank you, but he didn't fight me, and that was enough. Adam struggled, more than he let on. Inheritance taxes hit harder than expected, and without the proper structure or legal guidance, which I conveniently forgot to remind him to seek in time, he found himself owing more than he could handle. He sold the lake house, liquidated one of the accounts, tried to keep up appearances. Rachel left him not long after. And me? I didn't take the house. I didn't contest the will. I didn't need to. Because one morning, I dropped by the facility with groceries and sat with Frank while he drank his weak coffee and stared out the window at the blooming garden he now wandered through on slow afternoons. We talked about nothing: birds, the weather, a headline about local politics. As I stood to leave, I turned at the door and smiled. "Oh, by the way," I said, casually, like it was an afterthought. "Mom had a second letter. And that one was for Adam." I didn't wait for a response. I left him sitting there, cup in hand, eyes narrowed just slightly, as if trying to guess what it might have said, wondering if it was worse than the first, wondering if I was telling the truth, wondering if he'd ever get to read it. And maybe he will. Or maybe I made the second letter up entirely. That's the thing about stories: sometimes the best revenge isn't proving the truth. It's making them live with the possibility that they never knew it in the first place.